First of all, Nigel Bigggar is an ethicist, theologian and author. He only just recently retired from being Professor of Moral and Pastoral Theology at Oxford University. He still directs the MacDonald Centre for Theology, Ethics and Public Life at Oxford. Tomiwa Owolade is returning to Camden. He's done a masterclass here before about his book. This is not America. And obviously we're going to be talking about Nigel's book, Colonialism, as well. That's going to be the main subject of this discussion. So Tom is a writer, and his background, like mine, is in literature. He's even done some English teaching, but now he's pretty much a writer. He's very busy writing a lot of reviews and articles for publications such as the New Statesman and the Evening Standard. So welcome to both of our speakers. So the subject of today's discussion is going to be empire and the ethics of empire. Now, according to Yuval Noah Harari in his book *Sapiens*, empire and more particularly imperialism are second only to fascism and Nazism as political insults or swear words. So for many people, there's really nothing to be discussed, nothing interesting or nuanced to be said about empire. By definition, empire is imperialism, and therefore wicked and unethical. And that historical and ethical complexities can and should be reduced to a simple morality tale of oppressor versus oppressed. Simple. We could all go home now, because that's all you need to know. Well, no. We're going to have a discussion about that. So Nigel is an ethicist and a theologian, but the first thing I'd like you to speak about, Nigel, is how did you become interested in exploring these questions about empire as relate to theology and ethics, and how did you come to a different position to the one I just outlined about empire being just purely and simply wicked?
To respond to John Eric's questions, and I'll cover three things. I'll talk about why I took an interest in the topic of empire at all, and then I'll make some general comments about what empire is, what colonies are, and then I'll cut to the chase and, spoiler alert, I will tell you the conclusion I came to at the end of my book about the British Empire. And as has been said, I'm not a professional historian, although I do have a first degree in history. My main bread and butter is dealing with questions of right and wrong, good and bad. So I've attempted to do an ethical or moral assessment of the British Empire. So what first got me interested? Well, you've heard me talk for about 90 seconds. You probably haven't picked up which part of the country I'm from, have you? No? No. Some can recognise the fact that I'm Scottish. Born in Scotland, educated mostly in England, but I'm Anglo-Scottish. I'm a natural Brit. I don't answer to Scottish or English. I'm both. I'm British. What that meant was that 9 years ago, when Scotland held its referendum on whether Scotland should become independent and whether the United Kingdom should disintegrate, as an Anglo-Scot Briton, I was viscerally, instinctively against Scottish independence. Nevertheless, I felt morally obliged to look at the arguments in favour of Scottish separation, to see whether in fact they were good arguments and that my position was mistaken. And one of the arguments I came across on more than one occasion can be reduced to this equation. Britain equals empire equals evil. Therefore, Scotland needs to separate itself from the UK and repudiate Britain's wicked, oppressive, imperialist, racist legacy. And since I'd spent probably about 25 years reading about British imperial history, I knew that the equation, empire equals evil, is not tenable historically. So, the main point is, I came to write this book for a political reason, because I realised that history was being used to serve a political purpose that I regarded as destructive, and therefore I wanted to correct the record. So the motivation was political. Now, just some comments on empire and colonies. What's an empire? I think an empire is basically a people that expands. On this island, in the 8th century, what is now England was composed of about half a dozen or more little kingdoms, mostly Anglo-Saxon, some Danish. In the course of the 9th century, the Kingdom of Wessex, the West Saxons, expanded, dominated their neighbours, until by the year 1000 there was a single English state stretching from Cornwall to Northumberland. In other words, England, the nation state of England, was the product of imperial expansion in part of Wessex. And it wasn't just Europeans who did this, of course, everyone was doing it. So in the 1600s, when the alliance of Native American peoples called the Iroquois expanded north and west of, they were located just south of the Great Lakes in what's now the United States. When they expanded north and west, they displaced other Native American peoples, they dominated them, they created an Iroquois empire. When in the next century, in the 1700s, the Native American people, the Comanche, expanded eastwards, displacing the Apache, and created what one historian describes as a vast slave economy in what's now the southwest of the United States. In the 1820s, the Zulu kingdom under King Shaka expanded westwards in southern Africa, scattering other African peoples to 3 of the 4 winds, creating a Zulu empire. An empire is a people expanding, and many, many current nation states had an imperial phase and are the result of that. Colonies, what are colonies? Colonies I think of as being a specific form of empire. Classically, it's when one people, let's say the Phoenicians, in what was then, or in what is now Lebanon, in the 8th century BC, sent ships across the Mediterranean, pitched up in what's now Tunisia, and founded Carthage. Carthage was a colony. Carthage itself then expanded and created colonies in Spain and Sicily. Colonies are, if you like, enclaves of foreign peoples pitch up on a foreign territory and then embed themselves. Basic thing about empire is it is a universal phenomenon. It has been around since the dawn of time. It has been practiced on every continent by people of every skin colour. When I launched a research project in 2017 called Ethics in Empire, designed to look at empire from the ancient Chinese period to the modern, and to consider how ancient Chinese people and medieval Muslims regarded empire in moral terms, I was looking for critiques of empire. And one thing we early on discovered in this project was, if you're looking for an ancient Chinese or a medieval Muslim critique of empire, you won't find it. Empire was regarded as completely normal, completely unremarkable. What you will find are treatises dealing with the virtues and vices of emperors or empresses, but empire as such was completely normal. So universal throughout most of history. Okay, now what do I think about the British Empire? First of all, the British Empire lasted roughly 400 years from 1560 or so to 1960, and it stretched from Newfoundland on the east coast of Canada to New Zealand to the east of Australia. Vast extent of time. Not surprisingly, the British Empire was different things at different times in different places. It was sometimes different things in different places at the same time. For that reason, I try and avoid using the word colonialism at all, because the ism misleads. It implies a unitary thing, a coherent thing, whereas in fact the phenomenon of the British Empire was really very various. It wasn't a single thing. Now, in terms of making a moral assessment, after surveying the 400 years of British Empire, I ended up on page 476 of my book, 376 I think, with a list of the bad things that the empire presided over. And these included 150 years of slavery up until about 1833. It included the inadvertent spread of devastating disease to North America and Australia, and it included racial arrogance. All bad. But then on the next page, there's a list of good things. And I include here the fact that the British were among the first peoples in the history of the world to abolish slave trading and slavery. Up until that point, slavery was a universal institution practiced on every continent by people of every skin colour. Europeans were late in the game. Africans were busy selling other Africans to the Romans and the Arabs long before the Europeans entered the market in about 1440. The British, following the Danes and then the French, abolished the trade and then the institution in the early 1800s. In addition to that, the British Empire suppressed inter-ethnic warfare and enabled the conditions of economic prosperity, not least in northern India. The empire created liberal institutions. So you end up with a list of good things and bad things, and you ask the question, well, which list weighs more heavily? To which my view is, you can't possibly tell. I mean, how on earth do you weigh against each other the spread of disease, on the one hand, against the suppression of violence and the conditions of economic prosperity? Those things are of such different kinds, you can't weigh them to conclude that one was more weighted than the other. Can't do it that way. So that's the first part of my argument. You can't do a utilitarian cost-benefit analysis. It doesn't make sense. What you could do is to say, well, there have been some empires in the world, like the Nazi one, where even if the Nazis built motorways, which they did, reduced unemployment, which they did, and I think they invented the Volkswagen, which my wife and I drive, which is a good thing. Those are all good, but of course none of those things compensate for Auschwitz. So we can say that there may be some empires where the heart is so radically evil that nothing else compares. And you can say that centrally, at its heart, the Nazi Empire was evil, notwithstanding good things it might have done. And remember that the Nazis made the decision to exterminate the Jewish people in 1942, in the middle of a world war. So central was the final solution to the Nazi project, they were willing to compromise the success of the war by diverting military resources to exterminating the Jews. So central was this to their project. So the question arises, and some now claim this, was the British Empire like the Nazi one? Was Churchill equal to Hitler? Was the British Empire, as Hindi Andrews has said, worse than the Nazis? I can't give you the argument here. You'll have to read the book, please do. My answer is no. There is nothing in the British Empire equivalent to Nazism. And then I say, in addition to that, we can add a number of positive things. We can say that from about 1800, in the empire, there was a growing humanitarian impulse, beginning with the suppression of slavery and the slave trade, because the empire, having abolished the things, then devoted the second half of its life to suppressing slavery from Brazil across Africa, India, to Malaysia and New Zealand. And then the concern about slavery expanded into a general concern about the plight of the Aboriginal peoples of Australia and North America and Africa. In 1837, there was the foundation of the Society for the Protection of Aboriginal Peoples in London. So there was an increasing humanitarian concern within the empire, which shaped, to some extent, imperial policy. In addition to that, we can say that the empire contained self-corrective institutions such as a free press, which allowed people, including, for example, native Indians or South Africans, to criticize colonial government. There was an independent judiciary, that in Kenya in the 1950s was severely critical of colonial government, and then there was the Westminster Parliament, which exercised a constraining, had a constraining effect on colonial government. So the empire contains self-correcting, self-critical mechanisms, which the likes of China, Russia, Iran, Syria, and Zimbabwe do not have now. Next, we can say that the liberal vision of the empire eventually relaxing into a voluntary association of nations, the Commonwealth of Nations. That was articulated as early as the 1820s. Starting in 1867, Canada, then followed by Australia, South Africa and New Zealand, became increasingly independent and were virtually independent by 1930, and India was on the same track after 1919. And then finally, I think it says something important about the mature character of the empire that it committed itself in 1939 to fight Nazi Germany. And between May 1940, when France fell, and June 1941, when Hitler unwisely invaded the Soviet Union, the British Empire offered the only military resistance to Nazi Germany, with the sole exception of Greece. If you find yourself on the island of Sicily, at the southern tip of Italy, and you're driving around to the south of Mount Etna, which is the still live volcano in Italy, Mount Etna, and you're driving eastwards from the town of Agira to Regalbuto, on your left-hand side, you will come across a Second World War military cemetery. If you get out of your car and you walk into the cemetery, up the gentle slope, you will discover that this cemetery is full of Canadians. And if you wander around the cemetery long enough, you will come across a headstone to a certain H.R. Anderson, aged 28 years, who was killed in July 1943. And I remember this headstone because it's the first one I've seen that describes the person buried there as, quote, an anti-fascist fighter. Now, Anderson was a volunteer. He wasn't conscripted, he was a volunteer, and he answered the call to fight fascism. And I think it says something important about the mature character of the British Empire, that it was the empire that called him. That's my view of the British Empire. Thanks.
Thank you. So Tom, you reviewed Nigel's book in the New Statesman. Could you tell us, first of all, start by telling us what you do agree with Nigel about, and then maybe move on to where you felt in his book Nigel had maybe gone too far in terms of perhaps being too positive about British Empire.
Sure, thank you. First of all, I would recommend all of you to read Nigel's book. I think it's important, if you consider yourself to be a critical thinker, to read viewpoints from people that you might passionately disagree with. It's absolutely essential, otherwise you would not be able to express any genuinely thoughtful rebuttal to those viewpoints. So I think it's absolutely essential, if you want to cultivate the skills of critical thinking, to read books from people that you might passionately disagree with. As regards to the points at which I agree with Nigel, I agree with Nigel in terms of viewing empire not as a unitary ideology, as something which consisted of various things which I would argue even contradicted each other. So empire consisted of political and civil administration. It also consisted of military occupation. It consisted of missionaries. It consisted of financial interests. It consisted of various other social, religious, military, political forces. And I think, and it also differed from place to place as well. So one of the striking things about the British Empire in Africa, for example, was that indirect rule was typically used. So for example, in Nigeria, Britain ruled Nigeria through northern Islamic leaders in northern Nigeria. That was the way in which they ruled. And that's one way in which the British Empire was distinct from the French Empire, for example, where every colony within the French Empire was seen as part of a greater France. Every colony was seen as an extension of the metropole. And I think when we talk about empire, it's absolutely critical to emphasize what we mean, which empire, which particular territory, what time period, which aspect of empire. And I think it's so important to incorporate that greater level of nuance, that greater level of sophistication, if we want to actually have a more constructive debate about the British Empire. But I think my differences with Nigel is, as I say in the review, I think Nigel's book has two elements. So there is the element of pure history, accounting for the various ways that empire manifests itself. But there's also a polemical dimension to it as well. And my differences with Nigel is I think that there is some inconsistency between Nigel as the historian, who I largely agree with, and Nigel as the polemicist, with which I have some disagreements. Because the argument that Nigel makes in the book is that the problem with many anti-colonialist thinkers is that they present the British Empire as an essentially immoral endeavor. They therefore reduce the various complexities and the various nuances of the British Empire. And as Nigel said in his speech, he doesn't like the term colonialism because that implies itself an ideology. But where I disagree with Nigel in the book is when Nigel makes the case that the British Empire was essentially motivated by Christianity and the Enlightenment. And the reason why I find this an inconsistency is because if you think that the empire was not an ideology, was not a sort of unitary thing, I think the logical conclusion would be to be skeptical of the idea that the empire was essentially Christian and motivated by the Enlightenment. And one of the striking things about the empire is, in many cases, the paradoxical nature of it. So to give an example from West Africa, Ghana became the first country in Africa in 1957 to gain independence from the British Empire. And what was interesting about Ghana is that it consisted of the most educated population of the British Empire, and the people that actually led the anti-colonial movement in Ghana were largely educated, I think in fact exclusively educated in Christian missionary schools. And don't forget, Christian missionary schools is itself an extension of the British Empire. Many of the leaders were educated in Christian missionary schools, and they were often educated in the West as well. So Kwame Nkrumah, for example, the first leader of an independent Ghana, was educated in a Catholic missionary school, but also educated both in the US and also in the UK. And I think this illustrates the extent to which the anti-colonial movement was itself motivated by forms of the British Empire. The leaders in the anti-colonial movement were influenced by ideas in the West. They were influenced by being westernized. And if you look at another West African country, Nigeria, you also see this paradoxical situation, because the anti-colonial movement in Nigeria was led by the people in Nigeria that were most westernized. In fact, in Nigeria, the leadership of colonial Nigeria was often administrated by Muslims in the north of the country, whereas the anti-colonial movement was led by Christians in the south, Christians often educated by Western white people. And I think identifying this paradox is important because it illustrates the extent to which we shouldn't see empire as this sort of simplistic moral binary. It's full of tension, it's full of complexity, and it's full of fracture. And I think where I disagree with Nigel is where he makes the case that the empire was essentially motivated by the Enlightenment or Christianity. I don't think it was motivated by anything. It was motivated by multiple things, some of which contradicted with each other. And I think any constructive debate about empire needs to acknowledge the fractions and the tensions of it as well.
Thank you. So you talked about, you mentioned Christianity there, so shall we talk about Christianity briefly? So,
Sure.
When we go back to the debates about abolishing slavery in the late 18th century, the early 19th century, there were Christians on both sides of the debate, weren't there? So the abolitionists were motivated by their Christianity, but there were also Christians that were prepared to justify and argue for maintaining slavery. So, Nigel, it goes without saying, I think, that you admire those whose Christianity
Yes.
motivated them
Yes.
to oppose slavery,
Yes.
and you lament the fact that there were some Christians that were blind to the evils of slavery.
Yes.
So how does Christianity inform these debates about the ethics of empire?
Yeah, really important question. So I was interested to hear Tom sort of read back what he read in my book in terms of my arguing that Christianity was central or dominant in the empire. If I gave that impression, then I didn't mean to, because I don't think we can talk about what was essentially, what the empire was essentially. When I thought about that question, I thought to myself, well, I'm not sure I believe in essences. I mean, what's the essence of Nigel Biggar? Speaking from the inside, I can tell you, he's a bundle of contradictions. I mean, I have a certain character, but it's not entirely coherent. So I wouldn't say that Christian humanitarianism was essential or dominant. All I said more cautiously was it was growing in the 1800s, and it was really important. I mean, I certainly knew about the most of the energy in favour of abolishing slave trading and slavery in the late 1700s was Christian. Some of it was Enlightenment, mostly non-conformist Christian. And then, as I say, that expanded into a general concern about Aboriginal peoples and their fate in the 1800s. And although in the late 1800s, what I regard as the most vicious racist view that there are some peoples in the world with darker skins who are, as it were, naturally, permanently inferior and destined to be ruled over by white people or whatever, that did gain some traction, but it never dislodged. And some people, I'm reading a book right now which thinks that dominated. It didn't dominate, it never dislodged the earlier Christian notion that regardless of cultural development, individuals are equal under God regardless of race. And that those two things remain vying in the empire to the end. But the Christian impulse, I mean, I'm a Christian, both personally and professionally, but I was surprised, actually, having surveyed the empire, just how strong that impulse was in the 1800s.
Yeah, it's and the elements of Christianity is fascinating as it relates to the empire, because again, many of the most passionate opponents of the British Empire in the 20th century were educated in Christian missionary schools, and were they were imbibed with some of the universalist moral values that is found in Christianity. I think there's something else I want to say about the empire, which I should have said earlier, which is that if we look at one of the most contentious, probably the most contentious issue at the moment, Israel and Palestine, I've found the discussion about the relationship between the British Empire and Israel fascinating, because I've been doing quite a lot of reading about it. And even though the Balfour Declaration of 1917 guaranteed the state of Israel, a Jewish state, to exist in Palestine, after about the late 1930s, the British Empire actually reduced the number of Jewish immigrants that could come to Palestine. And in the 1948 war, Britain was on the side of Jordan. And in the 1947 UN resolution that created the State of Israel, Britain actually abstained on that. So it's and the reason why the State of Israel existed, and why many of the early Jewish leaders of the State of Israel feel a greater affinity to America, is because America supported the creation of the State of Israel in 1947. Britain was actually very lukewarm about it. And I think that is again the extent to, but if you ask anyone now, they would just say, well, Israel-Palestine is just the fault of the British.
Well, British soldiers had been targeted by by Zionists.
Exactly. It was an those Zionists saw themselves as anti-colonialists as well.
Yeah. I should say at this point, by the way, this is a whole big subject, and maybe a separate.
But it does relate to empire.
Maybe it does, of course it does. But maybe before we get sucked too big into it, let's have another masterclass for that one. But
I could get stuck into Israel Palestine, but let's put it aside for the moment for next time. Just on the Christianity thing, there is a certain sense, it's quite true, that Christian notions of human equality were very influential in terms of the growth of African nationalism. But also liberal notions of popular representation and of popular autonomy. Those notions that were spread from England to India and Africa were the seeds of the empire's own destruction, or at least the seeds of the empire's, as I put it, relaxation into the Commonwealth.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about the rise of this sort of anti-colonialism or post-colonialism, if you like, because I think it's the rise of that and its kind of explosion to some extent even more into the mainstream, let's say from approximately in the 2010s and really crescendo sort of in the late 2010s and in the period when you started setting up your Ethics and Empire project. So, I mean, it seems to me, I'm not a historian, but revisionism in historical studies and in sort of thinking about history and historiography, that's quite a common thing. So think about the motivations of why people are kind of pushing perhaps an excessive criticism of the British Empire, perhaps in your view. I mean, to some extent, you could argue that it's just the natural process of revisionism. You've had history being told a certain way, that's the official version, and then along come a new group of historians to say, well, hold on just a minute, what about this? You're not giving this due emphasis and blah, blah, blah. What I'd like to know is, do you kind of concede anything to those revisionists, those post-colonialist, anti-colonial historians? You know, were they right to push back and critique empire the way they did, and it's just that they went too far? What would you concede to their view?
So I think we have to distinguish between historians proper and activists.
Okay.
Right. So in terms of you're quite right in terms of fashions of history, because you know, basically every new generation of historians has to think of a new angle. That's part of career development or career advancement. So, and of course, every generation reacts against the previous one. So what's happened in recent decades is that historians of empire have focused on what the empire looked and felt like from the bottom, not the top. So subaltern studies, and that's I cannot object to that. It's a perfectly reasonable and important correction to attention. So no complaint about that. On the more activist side, my complaint is this: I think that it's not as if European or British empires are beyond criticism. That's not in dispute. What's curious, however, is the focus on European and British empire. I mean, insofar as empire, as I said, has been conducted by people of every skin colour on every continent, and arguably China is an empire right now, why the focus on white empires or British empire? And it seems to me that one explanation is this is an assault on the record of the West. And again, this is not, I'm not saying that the West doesn't deserve to be criticised. There's lots about the West that I would criticise. But at a time when the West, with its freedoms, is under some pressure from autocratic countries like China and Russia, one needs to be, as it were, discriminating with criticism of the West and not to paint with a very broad brush. So I'm suspicious of the focus on criticising the British Empire as a proxy of the West.
To me, what do you think the revisionists? And by the way, I mean, just, we should mention Edward Said's Orientalism, Franz Fanon, The Wretched of the Earth. These are the kind of the two key texts of post-colonialism, and you know, what I'd like to ask you again is the same as I asked Nigel. What did they get right, but where do you think maybe they went too far?
Yeah, I think where they did get things right is given people who otherwise would not have been able to articulate their own experiences of racism and bigotry and oppression, the language with which to make sense of their experiences. I think that's something that both of them definitely got right. But what I find striking about both Edward Said and also Franz Fanon is again something that I alluded to earlier, which is the extent to which they themselves were extremely westernized thinkers, shaped profoundly by the West. Said was a Christian Arab that was educated in a British, I believe, Christian school in Egypt, and later on went to America as a teenager. Franz Fanon was born and raised in Martinique, which isn't simply a sort of colony of France, but is an integral part of France itself. and was also educated in a French lycée school as well. So the extent to which they themselves were westernized is striking for I think a couple of reasons. One of them is that I think Nigel is right to mention that it is very unusual to see thinkers from say China or say Russia or say Iran condemning imperialism, the imperialism of those countries, whereas it's much more common for people in the West to do the same, and I think that is something that is striking, and I think it relates to an argument made by this gentleman, Pascal Bruckner, Tyranny of Guilt, and Bruckner's argument is that you can't really understand the West without understanding Christianity, and one of the key aspects of Christianity is of course the notion of sin, the notion of self-criticism, and in some cases self-abnegation. And Bruckner argues that the reason why the West is basically offered, many Western thinkers are offered masochistic in comparison to thinkers from other cultures, other civilizations, is because of Christianity. And in fact, this is something that Friedrich Nietzsche argued as well in the late 19th century. One of the reasons why Nietzsche was contemptuous of Christianity is because of what Nietzsche saw as a slave morality, the emphasis on compassion within Christianity. So I think what both Fanon and Said got right is provided a critical language for those people who were discriminated, oppressed by colonial forces, to make sense of that. But I do also agree that it's striking that Western thinkers and writers, far more so than thinkers and writers from other cultures, are excessively critical of the West.
I mean, again, thinking about the motivations of the social justice identity anti-colonial left, shall we call it, they would rage against Christianity, a lot of them, and I'm sure most of them would claim to be atheists or certainly non-religious. But is there an extent to which, as Tom just pointed out, really they are very much the inheritors of Christianity, the idea that the meek shall inherit the earth, the weak, the victim, the oppressed, they are the ones to be raised up.
The wretched of the earth.
The wretched of the earth, absolutely. I mean, it sounds absolutely that.
And Christian missionaries in North America or Africa were often highly critical of what was happening to native peoples, and would protest to London and bring the case of native peoples to London. So often Christian missionaries were among the critics.
That reminds me of the film The Mission, starring Robert De Niro, about the Spanish and Portuguese in South America, worth a watch.
When did that come out?
Oh, that's from the 80s, I think.
Okay. Just yesterday.
A little bit dated, but it's a good film, man. It's a very good film, lovely soundtrack. Do you want to come back?
No, can I ask Tom a question? I mean, Tom, you were brought up in Nigeria.
Yeah.
Okay. And you were there until the age of 9?
Yeah.
Okay. What did you learn at school? What did you learn? What kind of attitudes were in the air about the British colonial past?
It was total indifference. I learned nothing about the British Empire. I think I was probably too young. Maybe if I stayed longer, I might have learned more. But the general atmosphere now, whenever I go back to Nigeria, is indifference, total indifference. Because
just history.
because I think what most Nigerians think about now is issues that are more pressing. to do with religious conflict, poverty, inflation, terrorism, various other issues rather than empire. And in fact, it's striking because many Nigerians, and you allude to this in your book, Chinua Achebe, almost have a kind of sentimental nostalgia for the British Empire. Because they would argue that Nigeria should not really be a state. There are over 200 different ethnic groups in the country, and they speak different languages, they follow different customs. So up until, and Nigeria's only been a country for about 63 years. So they are skeptical of the unitary Nigerian state. And that's one of the reasons why there was the Biafran War in the late 60s as well.
Okay, interesting.
So, I mean, one of the criticisms of your book, Nigel, that some reviewers have made, and I should say the reviews have been very
Polarised.
mixed and polarised, and who'd have thought it, depending on the ideology of the person doing the reviewing, coming into it in the first place. But one disagreement, and obviously one of the things you were attacked for by some fellow academics, was the idea that the balance sheet kind of sort of, they brought the railways, but on the other hand, slavery and that kind of, and I think you've already dealt with that actually in your opening remarks. You dealt with that's, you don't advocate just some silly weighing up and saying,
Can't do it.
No.
Do it
So, but what about whataboutery?
Yes.
So whataboutery. So some people would say, well, you say, well, why is nobody talking about the Arab slave trade? Why do people only want to talk about the Atlantic slave trade? So, I mean, granted, we should be honest and comparative about the bad things that other empires and other peoples have done, but sort of what's the right balance of that? How do you avoid sort of, just trying to shift the attention from what this country has to be ashamed of by saying, well, other people did bad things too. What's the right balance there, do you think?
Well, that's a really good question. I'm not sure I can answer it very clearly. I suppose what I'd say is, if you want to come to a judgment about the 150 years of British involvement in slavery, at least you have to take into account that at the time everybody was doing it, right? So that's the first thing. So just don't pick on the British. Everyone was doing it, and then you have to ask yourself the question: why was everyone doing it? Because to us it seems abhorrent, but to people in the past, from ancient times up until 20th century, peoples were involved in enslaving other peoples. And then the other thing to note is that it was Northwest European nations, first of all the French in 1793, then the Danes in 1804, then the British in 1807, who were the first to abolish slave trading and then slavery, although France and Napoleon reversed that 10 years later. But this was the first time in the history of the world. So by all means, if you wish, criticise Britain for some Britons being involved in slavery from about 1650 to 1807, 1833, but do bear in mind that the British were amongst the first peoples in the history of the world to abolish both and then to use imperial power to suppress both from Brazil to New Zealand. So it's not that I want to, I suppose I'm a bit puzzled because I can't remember when I first learned about British involvement in slavery, but as far as I can tell, I know it the whole of my life. It's not news, and I'm kind of surprised that people think it's news now. It isn't news. I've known about it the whole of my life, and I just want this to be put into context, rather than have the British picked out as, we did slavery, everyone did it, and by the way, other nations did it long after we did.
So you're more comfortable with, if these post-colonial, anti-colonial activist academics want to criticise the British Empire, that's fine, as long as you're also similarly criticising the same things happening in other places.
I've said this for ages. I mean, by all means, let's remind younger generations of Britons about British involvement in slavery from 1650 to 1807/33. By all means do that. But why do you want them to forget about what happened 1807, abolition of trade, 1833, abolition of slavery, until the present day? Why forget the second part, which is much closer to us, when the British Empire used its predominant global power to suppress the thing from Brazil to New Zealand? Why forget about that? So I guess my kind of, in brief, my position is, please let's have the whole story.
Yeah,
Tom,
I think they would argue that the reason why we should emphasize the first part of those two things is because they would argue that the second part is already sort of expressed by many mainstream institutions, and that the second part is sort of seen as the mainstream the mainstream part, and that the first part, the part about slavery, has been neglected.
Okay. Look, I've no objection to I've no objection at all to telling the whole truth. Just let's have both bits. Yeah.
So I mean,
and also let's put British involvement in slavery in context as a worldwide institution, and what made the Danes and the Brits and later the French unusual is that we abolished it.
So we've got this revisionism, post-colonial, sort of the voices of Said, Fanon, many academics today.
And also,
you're pushing back against
and also the Ibn Warak.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. Okay. So the question is sort of pushing back against the overreach of that. Where does it become pushing back too far and going? So the pendulum swings. You know, first it's all hooray, the British Empire is wonderful. Then we go to oh dear, the British Empire is pure evil, just like the Nazis.
Yeah.
When the pendulum sort of swings back, where should it stop, Tom? Do you think? Because I think you feel
I don't see it as a pendulum in any way. I see it as when somebody says the British Empire was wonderful, was great, the British Empire was evil, was terrible. My immediate response is, what do you mean? Can you be more specific? Which aspects of the British Empire? Which territory? Which elements of the British Empire? And I think one of the problems with this entire debate or discourse is the lack of specificity, the lack of nuance, and the reliance on moral generalizations based not on any sort of faithful rendering of the historical facts, but just based on moral sort of vibes, essentially. So I would push back upon anyone that makes any general claims to be more specific.
And so really, to sum up your criticism of Nigel's book, really, you say he emphasises that the British Empire was morally complicated, which you agree with, but elsewhere he makes positive generalisations about this same empire. So you felt that while there might be some that make too many negative generalisations about the empire and don't give it enough nuance, you felt that Nigel perhaps was giving it too much of the benefit of the doubt. Would that be fair to sum up your criticism?
Yeah.
Do I get to defend myself?
Yes, you do. Of course. Absolutely.
I mean, I don't want to be defensive. I simply want to say that, without a doubt, my book was a reaction, right, against the story that the British Empire was a litany of racism and economic exploitation and gross, unjustified violence,
And nothing
etc.
but.
And I would say that's not true. And if I push the boat down a little bit too far the other way, it's a reaction.
Okay, thank you. Right, I think we'll get some questions now from some of you. Yes.
Do you think, question for Nigel, do you think there's so much focus on the wrongs of the British Empire because the shadow of that history still weighs very heavily on the world? I mean, with the Biafran War and the Israel-Palestine conflict, do you think that it's more about like the lingering
just going to stand up because if I can't see you at the back, you can't see me. So okay, the question is, we have a negative view of the empire because of the continuing conflicts in Israel, Palestine, and such. Okay, so there are certainly there are continuing negative effects of British imperial rule. That's for sure. Now, in terms of Israel, Palestine, the British spent from about 1920 to 1947 trying to build a state that both Arabs and Jews could live in, and failed. Since then, we have a situation where the state of Israel dominates that area. I guess I feel that the responsibility of the British Empire ended. I mean, it's now in the hands of Israel to sort that one out. But so without a doubt, there are current conflicts that owe their origins to the British Empire. All I'd say is, I mean, that's. I mean, you won't find a state in the world where that isn't the case. And also, I want to say, I concede that. I also say that, for example, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and even Israel are among the most liberal and prosperous countries in the world. All of them creations of the empire. So there's more than one side to the story. But I grant you that there may well be continuing conflicts that are a result of the dissolution of empire.
Yes.
Because of the Great Commission, do you think that Christianity will always inevitably be a tool of colonization?
Because of the what commission?
Great Commission, it's like the last thing that Jesus said, which is like spread the word of God.
Yeah.
It's kind of like you have to convert people.
And do I think Christianity will always
be a tool of like colonial power and like used to dominate areas? That's a very thank you for that question. I think again it depends on context, because it seems like an obvious thing to say, but many people use Christianity for their own particular ends, and again, as I said earlier, one of the striking things about Christianity, and one of the reasons why certain thinkers like Nietzsche despise Christianity is precisely because of that element of compassion, that element of emphasizing universal human rights. But it's obviously the case throughout history, and even in some places today, that Christianity is also used to dominate certain groups of people, or to repress certain groups of people. So again, it would depend on the particular situation. But with Christianity, I always like to think of it in dialectical terms. So there's always that tension and that conflict, and I don't think that's going to go away anytime soon.
Yes.
Nigel, you said about how there was empire everywhere previously, and then more recently we saw these big European empires spread further than just to one landmass, but across the whole world, for instance. Do you think it's, this part for either of you really, but do you think it's perfectly likely that had European nations not done it first, we would have had empires spreading from potentially other areas of the world, and then we'd have the reverse kind of thing? Do you think that's perfectly possible?
Yes, I mean, empires have been a feature of human life since 4 or 5 millennia ago. Everyone was doing it. And long before Europeans got into it, there were empires, which tended to be land-based. I mean, the difference, perhaps one distinctive feature of European empires was that Europeans had acquired the naval technology to cross oceans. Whereas before then, a lot of the empires would have been contiguous in terms of, the Mongol Empire stretching from China to the borders of Eastern Europe. It was a contiguous landmass. So the Europeans learned to cross oceans, and that's why their empire spread from Britain to New Zealand, for example. So it was just an accident of technology, really. If it hadn't been the Europeans, others would have done it. And in fact, the Maori didn't originate in New Zealand. They crossed oceans to get there. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I guess also like if we're seeing like building an empire as like a sort of almost instinct kind of idea, like as a human kind of thing, as part of human nature, and if, for instance, like racism is another, in a different way, human instinct, part of human nature, I guess, do you think that maybe the punishment, like the way we negatively view the empire is just as a result of, as humans negatively viewing racism now? It's like we've sort of overcome the instinct to, like, we now condemn that kind of thing. Do you think like there's some accuracy there? And I don't know if that makes sense, but like.
Right. So okay, we do condemn racism entirely now. I guess empire takes different forms, and it does mean the domination of one people over other peoples. Sometimes other peoples accept it and integrate. I think the Romans were quite good actually at dominating peoples and then bringing them up to the top of Roman society and politics, so that subject peoples then identified as the Romans. And the British were less good at that, perhaps because of racial prejudice. Yeah.
I'll throw in what Yuval Noah Harari says about this. He says, to answer your question, he says, evolution unfortunately has made Homo sapiens, like other social mammals, xenophobic creatures. Sapiens instinctively divide humanity into two parts, us and them. Well, we can see that in some of these culture wars being fought over these historical interpretations, can't we? Imperial ideology from the Emperor Cyrus of the Persians onwards has tended to be inclusive, though, and all-encompassing. Even though it has often emphasised racial and cultural differences between rulers and ruled, it has still recognised the basic unity of the entire world, the existence of a single set of principles governing all places and times, and the mutual responsibilities of all human beings. So Yuval Noah Harari is sort of saying that empire is one of the key things, including religion and money and various other sort of human inventions which have unified the world and had a broad range of effects. Negative, sure, particularly in local situations, but in the longer term, lots of things that we take for granted as quite normal have resulted from these kinds of things. Alan?
Am I allowed a two-parter?
Two-parter. Well, go on then.
Firstly, can you ever reconcile...
Could you stand up so I can see you?
Oh, yeah. Can you ever reconcile imperialism with countries' rights to self-determination? And secondly, why is it that pretty much every country, when given the choice, rejected British rule, sometimes violently, and now they almost uniformly celebrate an Independence Day?
Okay. So the first question again?
Self-determination. Can you ever justify an empire considering the country should perhaps have a right to self-determination?
Well, sometimes in empires, I guess I think of the Austro-Habsburg Empire in Eastern Europe. Sometimes empires contain peoples who, for various reasons, are content to be part of an empire. So sometimes, and that means the imperial centre has to grant different people sufficient autonomy for them to be content. But being part of a larger unit sometimes can have advantages. So it is not the case that people always resent being part of a larger empire. What was your next question?
The second bit was about why do most nations, when given the choice, they rejected the British rule, and a lot of them celebrate their Independence Day, often having it as national holiday.
Yeah. Okay. So, countries like India, there came a point where most peoples, or at least the elites of most peoples, want to rule themselves, and unless they become fully integrated into the colonial country, in order to do that, they have to get rid of the foreign colonists. I mean, I guess the British failed, in a sense, in India to integrate Indian elites, so that there was, as it were, a co-British, Indo-British or British-Indian enterprise there, and therefore it was either the British or Indians. That I think was a failure. But there may be some cases, or I'm racking my brains to think of them, where the originally dominant imperial power permits, if you like, the native people to grow up in it and to take full part in government. So in the sense that over time there's no distinction between the imperialists and the native peoples. They are one. And I think the Romans were better at that than the British.
Well, the French tried to do that in Algeria.
Okay.
And it failed.
Okay. Right. Yeah.
Right, we've got a few more hands up, and we can probably do 5 or 10 minutes more if people want to end at 5. So I'll try and get as many questions in as I can. Yes, you go next.
Sorry, I didn't hear that. Do I think the British Empire caused India to become a third world country? I mean, that's okay. Talking in terms of economics. No, well, okay. There is an argument that, I mean, Shashi Tharoor will make the argument that the British impoverished India because, I forget the numbers now, before the British Empire, before the British took over India, it had a high proportion of global GDP. Though I'm not quite sure how you can calculate that because the data is so uncertain the further you go back, but let's suppose that's true. And by the time the British finished with it, India's share of GDP globally was a fraction. But Tirthankar Roy, who is a Bengali-born economic historian at the London School of Economics, will say that's not true. What happened was that in the 19th century, European nations grew economically so fast that they then outpaced India, and India's relative share of global economic production declined. It wasn't that India was impoverished, it was just overtaken by others that developed faster. So I think that's what my initial response to that point. Reparations?
Do you think Britain should apologise? You know how Prime Minister always going to India and refusing to apologise for what the empire did in India?
Do you mean apologise in general, or for specific things like, for example, the Amritsar massacre?
Yeah, things like that.
For something like that specifically, rather than in total?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's perfectly appropriate, let's say, to go to India and say, as a Briton, I deeply regret what happened. To apologise implies that I'm responsible for it. I'm not. General Dyer did that. I didn't do it. So I'd say expressing regret that it happened, but I don't think I'm responsible for it. So I think an apology is not quite the appropriate
I mean,
thing.
like a Prime Minister or British government taking responsibility for what Britain did. Because Prime Ministers go to India and they, I think it's David Cameron who refused to say sorry.
Rather than personally.
Huh?
I think you mean like rather than personally.
Yeah, not personally.
Apologetic as a sort of.
Well, so I just think, I think expressions of regret are appropriate. Taking responsibility for what General Dyer did 100 years ago, I think it doesn't make sense to me. So express regret that it happened, and yeah, it's entirely appropriate. To take responsibility is not appropriate because the current British government is not responsible. So it's a century ago. It is what I would say. You don't look very satisfied.
Tom, do you have a view on reparations or apologies?
Again, I think it should be done on a case-by-case basis. So I'm not opposed to reparations in principle. So, for example, I know that in the 1980s, America paid reparations to the descendants of the people, of the Japanese Americans that were interned in the camps in the 1940s during the Second World War, and I would fully support that. I would also, of course, fully support the reparations that were paid by Germany to the State of Israel, and also to individual Jewish families that were affected by the genocide of the Jewish people in the Second World War. But I think it should be done on a case-by-case basis. What I'm slightly skeptical of is when anyone basically that was affected in any way by the British Empire, for example, would want to claim reparations. I think reparations should be predicated on a specific allegation of a crime, essentially, rather than a sort of generalized admission of guilt. Because if it's just about guilt, then saying sorry should be enough, and then asking for money should be ultimately futile. But if it's a specific crime,
should we also distinguish between cases where an atrocity was a result of government policy, or whether it was just rogue individuals? For example, a lot of the worst abuses and atrocities in, say, Tasmania and other parts of Australia were committed by settlers, just rogue, doing their thing, and they were prevented from doing that by the government. The government sort of tried to stop those abuses and attacks on the indigenous people. So that's a distinction, isn't it, between what was officially sanctioned by the authorities and by the government in Westminster, and that which was just for abuses of individual settlers that broke the law.
I think that distinction should be made.
Yes, I think this might have to be the last question. Yes.
You mentioned like the two parts to colonialism and slavery. So the part where it was carried out and the part where Britain abolished slavery and colonialism. I personally, this is more of a comment, I personally don't really see like the relevance of focusing on that part, because it doesn't at all compensate for anything that Britain did, and it also is very simplistic. It assumes that everything after that point, like the effects of colonialism and slavery, continue to this day and will for centuries to come, which is also why the government today should be held responsible and should address the way that they're benefiting from slavery and the British Empire. So that's why they should be paying reparations to countries. So yeah, I just don't really see the relevance of talking about them abolishing it as if it wasn't.
Okay, so your position is that nothing compensates for what was done, and you're quite right. The dead are dead.
Yeah, just mainly like talking about them abolishing it, and like you mentioned, like focus also on the second part where they abolished it, and I just personally don't see why we would. Like why? I mean, obviously it's good to address it, but why would we focus on the abolishing of it when it was like shameful to even have to abolish it in the first place?
Well, I think the reason is that slavery for 150 years can't be undone. All you can do is stop it. You can't do anything else.
And it's the entire human race that needs to be ashamed, isn't it?
And everyone needs to stop it. I mean, so I guess the question is why, give us some credit for being one of the first people in the history of the world to abolish it.
argue.
No?
No, I
Oh,
don't.
no.
Arguably, the reason the British people had to abolish slavery in the first place is because of the extent that we took it out to literally taking a race and like enforcing slavery. Like,
So I
why
guess.
should we give credit of their abolishment of slavery when like the imposition of it in the first place was like horrible?
Well, I guess my response is, why pick on us? Everyone was doing it. Everyone.
Okay, look, I think, look, obviously, this could turn into a sort of a tennis match of comments, and we've nearly come to the very end of the masterclass, and we avoided it for so long, and here we are at 5 o'clock, and it's like the witching hour. So, yes, listen, everybody. Perhaps Nigel and Tom will be happy to answer your questions, perhaps sort of face to face. Form an orderly queue, please. But it's 5 o'clock, so I would just like to say a big thank you to you both for coming.